Dystopian nightmare or endless world of wonder? That question was first pitched to us in a report, and now I might tend to think endless world of wonder. I might have some slight bias because we are in this industry, and I think when you ask that question of any technology, though, you have two sides of it. So with anything, you can use technology in a positive way or a negative way. So I think much like the internet or anything like that, you could have VR and AR causing wonder or causing things that might make the world a bad place. So as we go through, I'm going to be talking about opportunities and trends. I'll try and keep it quite beneficial for those of you in the audience and watching later, hopefully. But firstly, who are we? So we are Virtual Arts. We're building a leading state-of-the-art virtual, augmented, and mixed reality content and tech company. So we're making content in the sense of games, animations, and interactive experiences, but we're also making our own unique technology, which will fuel all of that content. So we think that actually that makes us quite in a unique position to talk to you today about the trends, the opportunities, because we're a player in this market, like I'm sure a lot of you are in this room as well. We are right now 12 people, just up from the 11 at the end of August. We come from a background of ARM, the world's leading semiconductor IP company, and also Sony Gorilla Cambridge, who made a number of games, which you can see here. The most recent was Riggs, which was a launch title for the PlayStation VR headset. They also made Killzone Mercenary and Little Big Planet and had a number of success with BAFTAs in that area as well. Meanwhile, in ARM, we made a number of tech demos, always pushing the boundaries of the latest tech. So we've done a number of independent research pieces with the University of Cambridge, Judge Business School. The reason for this was we found as a company newly forming in this market that we actually had to do a lot of research to define our own strategy. So I'll be sharing a little bit of our own independent research and also commenting on secondary research as well. So the first trend and opportunity is really that the VR, AR, and MR investment opportunity is now. So why do we think that? So here's a hype graph from Gartner, was produced this year in July. And on that graph, you'll see augmented reality and virtual reality there, most keyly, coming out and developing into a market, an established market for tech. Augmented reality just behind there, in the shroud of disillusionment, but that was obviously in July with recent announcements. You can imagine that very much picking up and becoming more established as well. You might think that, well, VR, we don't hear as much about that as we do, say, things like 5G, and the reason for that is that they're on the up of the hype curve. So you'll hear a lot more about things like 5G, but what happens after that is actually where terms like deep learning, machine learning, and blockchain are, which is they start to trail off while the initial investors and the initial companies in that area actually start to figure out where this market is and what tech needs to be developed. Differently than virtual reality, which has now had that process, we've seen products in the market, and now it's actually becoming something where you can enter and you can make real money, real business in. So, other facts in this area. So this, bear in mind, is for US households, but for VR, it's predicted by Superdata that the upswing in US households adopting these headsets will be similar in magnitude and speed to the color TVs and the internet. So actually a far quicker rate of adoption than things like PCs, for example. When you look at the data in terms of finance, in terms of money, this one actually says 100 billion by 2021, again by Superdata there. So this market is going to be mainly, today in 2017, we can see it's mainly virtual reality. But tomorrow, and in the years 2021, you see the upswing of augmented reality coming there and taking on a lot of that market share. When you break it down by platform, we're actually looking at AR, again sweeping up, but it's all mobile AR. And you can see today, in the medium color of blue there, that it's mobile VR, and that continues to grow. Meanwhile, the lightest color in blue is console and PC tagged together as one thing for VR, which stays pretty consistent, does grow slightly, but percentage-wise just loses out to the great upswing in growth from mobile. Now, the second opportunity and trend for those is a more diverse user base is coming to VR. So the great thing about VR is that everyone has the innate experience of putting on a headset, and straight away everyone can look around and enjoy. You don't get that with traditional mediums, by which I mean things like console and PC. You don't think about the big barrier to entry that is holding a controller. That would just put some people off, whether it's the older demographic or whether it's people that just don't know automatically where the square button is. And we found a lot of that in our testing. When you put a headset on, you can't just say to someone, "I'll press square." They don't. It's not a given that people know that stuff. We're seeing this in the numbers as well in terms of diversity in this market. So this is sales figures. These were back in March. So you can see, as some of my other colleagues have mentioned, cardboard being a big seller. It was 10 million units in March. 5 million to Gear VR, again, mobile leading the way there. And the total units sold of VR headsets was over 18 million, and that was March this year. I've included Daydream there on the side because that was a very new platform back in March. But it's actually predicted that by the end of this year, that'll be slotting in roughly there, plus or minus movement from the others, at just over 2 million. Looking at the Gear VR now, you can see that if we take a snapshot from the same month this was, year on year, so in 2016, Oculus announced that 1 million people had actually used the Gear VR every month. In 2017, it's expected to be 6.7 units sold. So there's a vast majority of users coming to these platforms. Now here's a little snippet from our primary research. This is app numbers for the Gear VR. So if you look at April, there was 224 apps on the store. That is including gallery apps, I should note. If we look actually at the end of August, there was 986. That's year on year, a growth of, say, there, over 3 times. And just before flying out to this conference, Oculus have actually managed to reach their 1,000th app. So they are now just over that number in terms of released content. Now, when we talk about inclusion and being able to just look around, you might have noticed from that picture earlier, it's very instinctive to bring up your hands and actually use those. But at the minute, we are seeing a growth in controllers. And I think we will still see that. I think there's always a market for controllers in VR or other markets where you might have a racing game and you might not want to hold your hands up all the time and drive a steering wheel. And we're seeing that if we take the Gear VR as a great example, because in April, they released their controller as a new addition to the headset. At the time, it was selling for a £50, €50 sort of price mark. And the developers responded to this. So 4.5% of apps on the whole store supported the Gear VR controller in that month, in the same month they released. By May, that was up to 10%, and today, in the end of August, it was at 28%. But I do expect that that number, in terms of upswing, we'll quickly see a swing towards gesture controls when they're available. But what we're waiting for there is technology being able and capable of showing real-time gestures with all individual fingers on mobile or PC VR. So VR arcades will revitalize the arcade market is the next topic of conversation. So you may have noticed in those previous slides that the HTC Vive and the Rift actually back in March didn't have a great number of sales. There was just over 100,000 each on the slide. And that's obviously a big part because of the price tag. I'm sure we all know in the room it's about €2,000, give or take, for a PC to handle a Vive, plus the cost of the headset. And then when you add on top of that, actually, whether you've bought it yourself or had it as a gift, you've then got to convince whoever you share your living room with to give you all that space. And most people obviously live commonly in groups of families, so that's quite a big ask, which is why stepping up into that market is VR arcades. So the revitalization of the arcade market where perhaps we haven't spent so much time more recently. So one person who agrees with me here would be Mladen Sadat, the director of Viveport, who said actually in 1990, you can see there, 3.5 billion was made in revenue by Pac-Man, quote, just one game. I would argue slightly, come on, it's Pac-Man, it's not just one game. We can't all make Pac-Man. However, what I do think is interesting is this over here. So the actual piece of hardware that used to ship with that used to enable that for players in arcades. So this, as a platform, how many times have we seen this in arcades? It's always the same unit, right? And you just change the joypad around. Maybe you had a gun. But that as a standalone unit was able to be mass-produced and sold around the world and enable a vast amount of diverse content, going back to the point about diversity in users. So I do think there's a big opportunity on the hardware front for someone to do that for VR, to actually unify and be able to mass produce a physical piece that could allow everyone to use it in VR arcades and use any content that any developer wants to make without having to make bespoke hardware for every single platform or experience. And as well, that's obviously the converse choice of that. So you'd have a bespoke bit of hardware, and I hope we don't see that. That we don't have VR arcades, we have to be helped into your experience. And I think as well, when you think about chipsets coming from a background of ARM, it's easy as well to actually make a bespoke piece of silicon for that. So it doesn't have to be a PC card, or it could be a mobile card, but it's a unique bit and opportunity for vendors to sell something like that as well. And for developers in the room, it's a good market to think about when you're developing a game, that there is going to be VR arcades, and you might be able to do deals with those kind of vendors. Now, demand for high-quality 3D assets will exceed supply. So being someone who's in this market, this is a draw-call render from one of our early prototypes of our game Cargo Racing VR, which is out soon. So what you can see here, to break it down very quickly, is in one view, you have all of this going along. You have every single drawer of every single asset on there, and that's just one snapshot. And you've got the player looking all around all the time and seeing more of these. So you can't have very expensive, from a performance point of view, assets. For example, if we look at the cube here, we don't want a lot of lines rendering that one individual cube. But at the same point in time, you don't have a lot of control necessarily about where the user looks in VR. So you've got to have very high-quality looking assets, because they might get right up close to a wall or a cube that you've never intended. If you're a 3D asset developer, you could make a crate intended purely for the background of games, and then find out that someone's used it as a VR developer in a game where you're a tiny person running around a big course, and they're all of a sudden looking right up against this barrel, and it looks awful because of all the anti-aliasing. So that's why we have a demand for very high assets, but also very efficient assets, because you have the constraints in mobile VR of things like battery. And we know firsthand that doing our prototypes, there wasn't a great source of this content out there. So there is an opportunity for 3D asset artists in the room to add their assets to stores like the Unity Asset Store, like Sketchfab, and actually target them towards the new emerging VR market. Because as we see tools and creator tools becoming more widespread, allowing new people that won't have their own art teams and might want to just prototype very quickly, there'll be an upsurge in demand for these assets. And on that point as well, I think there's also a flip side to that, which is not only should you get your assets out there, but anyone, artists or not, there's going to be a big market in jobs for VR, AR, and MR on your CVs. And there'll be, while we know that as a 3D artist, you make a 3D asset for a game, it could be VR, it could not be, it doesn't make a lot of difference. But from a recruitment point of view, and there will be a lot of companies who are saying, I want a VR artist, not necessarily a 3D artist. And we're seeing an uprising in this from a marketing point of view, looking at keyword searches, for example. So it's worth thinking about that when you're making your CVs, when you're looking for jobs, to tag it with trends from today. And also, we are actually hiring as well. So if you are interested in jobs, we are hiring through virtualarts.co.uk/jobs. But moving on, there will be several big winners of the AR movement in the next year, is one of our predictions. So AR Kit and AR Core, I'm sure we all know about those in the room, big players entering that market. It was said when it was announced that AR Core would have 100 million devices by the end of their preview. And I like to imagine that David Burke always signs off his text messages with his full name and title. Meanwhile, on the Apple side of things, there was 381.3, if you can see it there, in 2017, when they announced machines supporting this. By the end of the year, it's expected, through Artillery, to have 505 units. And then moving forward to 2018, that's going to be 740 million units supporting ARKit. So that's a big market. If we take those numbers together, assuming that Google are going to finish their preview by the end of 2018, which it's fair to assume, having only recently announced, we could expect a market over 840 million by the end of 2018 for AR. And I'm sure it's pretty easy to imagine that if you're a developer in this area, if you sell something for £1, that's a lot of money, or the equivalent in in-app purchases. Now, this one's an interesting one. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts as well. MR is becoming AR. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's have some definitions first. So, VR, an artificial world, takes over your whole view. AR, virtual objects are added to the real world. And then MR, real objects are added to the virtual world, or virtual objects added to the real world. So this was a definition that I took from a publication in the technology and in the gaming space. And even in their definition, they're using the same definition for MR as AR. So there's a lot of confusion about, well, what is MR? And I think we'll continue to see that, and I expect MR actually to disappear as a term. So when I say MR is becoming AR, I think MR always was AR, if we think about augmenting reality and what that really means. So first, I'd like to say as well, hashtag MR, that was never going to work, right? It's hashtag Mister. That's just not going to become a thing. And we're seeing that in searches as well. People are searching for VR, AR, augmented, or virtual reality, not so much on the mixed reality side. But what is a mixed reality device? So HoloLens, obviously, for those in the room, I'm sure you're all aware that's the main one. I saw a Facebook ad recently as well, which was for a competitor for HoloLens. And they said, we do AR better than HoloLens. I thought, well, OK, that's more confusion about, well, what is MR then, if someone else is telling you that HoloLens is AR. But there is an opportunity in HoloLens as a market itself. As consumers, we probably haven't heard a lot about it because it's not aimed at consumers. And we might be thinking, well, HoloLens, it didn't work, right? It kind of went away as a term. Well, actually, there was, in January, HoloLens' commercial lead announced there was tens of thousands of units sold, so less than 100,000. Today's price is $6,000, so that might be in part why. And that is for the hardware and the commercial suite, so the software enabled to use it. But there are industry experts and big industries, automotive design, healthcare there, also architecture, where these devices are being used en masse. I'm sure we've all seen the videos from HoloLens where it claims these people are replacing all their desktop devices. They're throwing away their monitors in the bin because they've got HoloLenses now. So they must be incredibly happy with the software that they've got to support this, right? If only there was a cheaper solution. Well, there is about to be. So HoloLens as a spec, as I'm sure some of you might have realized, is being licensed, and these are the 5 main players that are releasing hardware for it. It'll all be available before the end of the year. The only ones that haven't announced a release date are HP and Asus. They're all marked at around $350, Asus $530 on the higher end of things. Most are announced for release in October, one in the holiday season this year. So there is a big market for developers who are targeting outside gaming to take what's already successful, not necessarily create something new, but take what's successful for healthcare in that industry on HoloLens and scale it down affordability-wise to one of these headsets. Because if you imagine the kind of industry leaders that are taking those HoloLenses at $6,000 to go, giving them to all their office, there's going to be the rest of the, let's say, 95% of hospitals, or whoever it is in that industry, are going to want to have that experience and keep up with the leading competitors, but won't be able to afford it. But they could afford something like this, and they could afford an application that goes alongside it. And I should say as well, on the hardware side of things, I think that's why MR is also becoming AR, because when you start to play with the hardware, you're no longer saying that MR is a pass-through of a glass, but now it's also VR headsets with pass-through cameras, and that's why I think MR as a term will disappear, or perhaps become more like XR or like immersive reality, and it will become an umbrella term for the whole of VR and AR. I've been Ryan Booth from Virtual Arts. That's our website. Feel free to look out for more for us through that. We'll be releasing a bit more of our research through that over time as well. And are there any questions at this point?